With that said, I'm going to speak briefly about an idea that we call the class concept and how it relates to PFAS. Professor Wagner yesterday did a really good job of explaining what she called chemical regulatory dysfunction in 3 big points. And I thought that was a good approach, so I'm going to give you my version today. And problem number 1 with our chemicals regulatory system is that most of the chemicals in commerce have not been tested adequately for health and safety. Of the 85,000 or so chemicals that are on the market in the US, 62,000 of them were grandfathered in when the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, was passed. That's the big law that regulates chemical use here in the US. And what that means is that manufacturers were not required to provide testing data on those chemicals. For the 23,000 or so new chemicals that have come to market since then, EPA has some health and environmental data on some of those, but it doesn't have data for the majority of them. And without that kind of data, EPA and the rest of the government are really limited in what they can do to regulate hazardous chemicals. I have to point out that these numbers are out of date now because TSCA has been revised and EPA changed the way they count this. But the big picture is still true. There are large data gaps when it comes to the health and safety of chemicals in commerce. Problem number 2 with our chemical regulatory system is that it's slow. Even when there is strong evidence that a chemical causes harm, it can take a long time, years and years, before it's regulated. And PFOA and PFAS are great examples of this. So way back in the mid-1970s, there was evidence suggesting that PFOA was in the blood of the general population. Also in the 70s, it was shown that PFOA and PFAS were immunotoxins. In the early 80s, PFOA was found in umbilical cord blood. And I could spend a long time going through all these examples, but the idea is that evidence of these chemicals' toxicity and of widespread exposure just kept continuing to build all the way up into the 2000s, when the major manufacturers of these materials voluntarily pulled them from the market. And even today, 10 or 20 years later, it's still the case that both PFOA and PFAS are largely unregulated at the federal level. They're not controlled by the Safe Drinking Water Act, by the Clean Water Act, by Superfund, et cetera. The third problem with our chemicals regulatory system is that it allows regrettable substitutions. So often when a chemical is regulated or phased out, the most obvious replacement is a chemical with a similar structure and also similar properties, both the good, useful properties, and also sometimes those same hazardous properties. And we saw this with the phase out of long chain PFAS and the replacement with short chain PFAS. The long chain materials were retired because of their persistence, their tendency to bioaccumulate, and their toxicity. And it's now increasingly clear that the short chain PFAS share some of those same concerns. And in addition to that, it may be more difficult to clean them up from the environment because our typical water treatment techniques like activated carbon don't work as well for the replacement chemicals. And PFAS are not just a cherry-picked example here. This has happened over and over again with flame retardants, with bisphenols, and other chemical groups. So these 3 intertwined issues, the lack of data on most chemicals on the market, the slow process of regulating them, and frequent regrettable substitutions, together they make it really difficult for our current system to function well. And indeed, evaluating the tens of thousands of individual chemicals one at a time is not working. It's taking too long, and it's not protective of public health. Instead, if we start to think about a smaller number of chemical groups or chemical classes with shared properties, then managing those health and safety concerns or evaluating them becomes more manageable. And this, it can be a way of navigating around those 3 challenges that I mentioned. A few years ago at one of our retreats, we came up with the idea that most of the harmful chemicals in consumer products fall into one of just 6 classes. And those 6 classes, you've probably heard us say this before, are PFAS, antimicrobials, flame retardants, bisphenols and phthalates, some solvents, and certain metals. And we don't say that these chemicals need to be banned across the board, rather that their use needs to be scrutinized, and we ought to really only use these when they're absolutely needed. The idea of treating PFAS specifically as a class is something that is gaining momentum, I would say, and this started, I think, back with the Helsinger and Madrid consensus statements from the scientific community in 2014 and 2015. And since then, different scientists have picked up this idea and published different takes on it. This paper here is something that we published with colleagues earlier this summer called Scientific Basis for Managing PFAS as a Class. And three of the big points are that the persistence and potential toxicity of PFAS make them all suspect, that there's not enough time to study them all, and that as a result, we need to avoid their use whenever possible.
2 minutes.
Okay, thanks. The idea of treating PFAS as a class is something that's gaining traction outside of scientific and academic circles too. And I think the most exciting development is what's going on in Europe, where a number of countries have put forward a proposal to enact an EU-wide phase out of non-essential uses of all PFAS. And it's really big, and it seems like it's actually going to happen. It was included in the major EU chemical strategy that was released just this week. I don't see something like this happening in the US in the near term, but there is a lot of interesting and exciting work going on to address PFAS as a class here. And you're going to hear more about that from the speakers that follow me. I need to stop talking now, but I want to end by drawing your attention to a couple of websites that you should check out if you haven't yet. The first is 6classes.org, where you can watch short videos, and compelling videos, if I do say so myself, about each of those 6 chemical classes I mentioned. The second is pfascentral.org, where we are compiling late-breaking news, science, policy, and events around PFAS. And we're also building a list of PFAS-free consumer products, or products made without the intentional use of PFAS. So with that, thanks for your attention.